Hello and welcome to the second in a series of presentations on the subject of dietary carbohydrate reduction. This presentation is entitled Carbohydrate Reduction, What It Can Do for You. My name is Dr. Marcus Hawkins. I'm a general practitioner here in Auckland, New Zealand. I've been a GP for approximately 22 years and prior to that worked in the hospital system in both general medicine and intensive care medicine. So here is an overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk about the consequences of the low-fat diet and the food pyramid. I'll talk a little bit about insulin resistance and the metabolic syndrome. Then what can be achieved with carbohydrate reduction. And finally, give you a brief introduction into reducing carbohydrates. So here is a slide that I've shown previously, the evolution of man up to a point. And as you can see, we've evolved from the primitive ape through to the tallest individual, Homo sapiens, to the rather large individual on the right-hand side of the diagram. We, as the Western world, have become obese and overweight. And as a consequence, many of us are now suffering from insulin resistance, which then leads on to a constellation of other disease processes, not least of all diabetes. This is not good. So now for some World Health Organization statistics. Worldwide obesity has nearly tripled since 1975. In 2016, 39% of adults were overweight and 13% were obese. And over 1.9 billion people were overweight. Of these, 650 million were obese. Prevalence of overweight and obesity in children and adolescents has risen from 4% in 1975 to 18% in 2016. Over 340 million children and adolescents are either overweight or obese. In Africa, the number of overweight children under 5 has increased by nearly 24% since 2000, and globally there are more people who are obese than underweight. This occurs in every region except parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And most of the world's population now live in countries where being overweight and obese kills more people than being underweight does. Closer to home, we now come to the fattening of New Zealand between 1977 and 2012. In 1977, 10% of adults were obese. In 2012, touching on 30% of adults are obese. And this coincides with a low-fat diet that was introduced in the late 1970s. Now for some more New Zealand statistics. In terms of adults, we are the third most obese country in the OECD. 1 in 3 New Zealand children are overweight or obese. In the 2019-2020 year, 9.5% of children were deemed to be obese. In the 2020-2021 year, this has risen to 12.5%. Childhood obesity differs by ethnicity and demographics. In other words, Pacific Island and Maori are often within the most socially deprived populations, and all are factors related to obesity. So how did the developed world get so fat? Well, I lay the blame squarely at the feet of this man, an American physiologist called Ancel Keys, and a force to be reckoned with within his sphere of work. In 1956, he initiated the landmark 7-country study, which looked at over 12,500 middle-aged men living in rural communities in Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, Finland, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United States. And this indeed suggested an association between cholesterol and heart disease. But it should be noted that there were some significant design flaws in that they collected minimal data from each country. They used food recall questionnaires, which are notoriously inaccurate, and he was accused of cherry-picking his countries. It must also be remembered that this is an epidemiological study, which can only ever show association, never causation. But it became a very influential study, principally due to his very, very strong personality. So now we come on to the diet-heart hypothesis and more. The hypothesis states that increased saturated fat increases blood cholesterol, and this then leads to heart disease, such as heart attacks. So in 1961, the American Heart Association suggested that Americans reduce the risk of heart disease by reducing saturated fat. This was really down to personalities and connections. Personalities such as Ancel Keys, who was well connected in the American Heart Association and other bodies at the time. In 1977, the United States Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs set its dietary goals for the American people, and it advised them to reduce total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sugar, salt, and to increase carbohydrates. This was forwarded through political expediency and not enough science. Senator John McGovern, who was in charge of the committee, stated quite clearly that they did not have time to wait upon the science and so pushed the policy forward. In 1984, the Lipid Research Clinic's primary prevention trial concluded that drugs can lower the risk of coronary heart disease. And this was a trial of a drug which reduced the risk of disease. It wasn't actually testing the effect of cholesterol reduction. It was more to do with a drug effect that improved outcomes. So it was somewhat of a misrepresentation. And then in 1992, the United States Department of Agriculture came out with its food pyramid, and this spread across the world and was adopted by many authorities. It's always a surprise to me that an agency that's selling food to the public actually determines what the public should eat. A real bad form of bias, I think. So the message was to reduce fat and to replace fat with carbohydrates, otherwise food doesn't taste so good. So now we come on to the consequences of reduced fat and increased carbohydrates in the diet, namely obesity and insulin resistance. And so with obesity, there's a tendency to develop pre-diabetes and then type 2 diabetes. And once one has a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, essentially, then one is more at risk of heart disease, stroke, kidney failure, blindness, amputations, etc. But insulin resistance is also associated with high blood pressure, and if left untreated, this can lead to heart attacks, heart failure, and strokes. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is a condition whereby obesity is associated with fat deposits or storage in the liver. If left unchecked, this can eventually lead to scarring or cirrhosis of the liver, and rarely this can then be complicated by liver cancer. And then polycystic ovarian syndrome, a condition of women of childbearing age, whereby they develop insulin resistance and multiple cysts, little bubbles on the ovaries, which are associated with inability to become pregnant. So now we'll talk a little bit about insulin resistance. When we eat bread, pasta, rice, potatoes and fruit, these are all forms of starch, sugar, carbohydrates, and they are broken down by the body into glucose molecules. Glucose then stimulates insulin to be released from the pancreas, and this then puts glucose into glycogen in muscle and liver cells, or converts glucose to fat. We routinely eat much more carbohydrate than we can use in a day, and as a result our glycogen stores are rapidly filled up. So the excess glucose is then converted into fat by insulin, which can be called the fat storage hormone. With chronic demand, insulin fails to work properly. The mechanism behind this is not clear at this point in time, but over time more and more insulin is required to convert glucose into glycogen and fat, and cells become resistant to the effects of insulin, and this is insulin resistance. Eventually, even very high insulin levels are ineffective, and blood glucose rises, resulting in prediabetes and then diabetes. Prediabetes and diabetes are blood glucose elevation on a spectrum. Insulin resistance is associated with blood vessel inflammation, even in the absence of diabetes, and this can then result in heart attacks and strokes. Often associated with insulin resistance is the metabolic syndrome. This is a collection of features broadly defined as central obesity with increased waist circumference, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, that is fat deposition in the liver as a result of carbohydrate exposure, impaired glucose control, which is reflective of insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and an abnormal cholesterol profile with a low level of protective cholesterol, HDL, and a high level of a bad fat known as triglycerides. Now, not everybody who is insulin resistant has metabolic syndrome, but everyone who has metabolic syndrome, by definition, has insulin resistance. So what can be achieved with carbohydrate restriction? Well, we can often see significant weight loss. We can see prediabetes reversed with normalization of the measure of prediabetes and diabetes, namely the HbA1c. We can see type 2 diabetes reversed or even remitted where some or all medication can be stopped. With high blood pressure, some or all medication can also be stopped. With non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, we can see this condition reversed, both with normal blood tests and normal ultrasound scan. And with polycystic ovarian syndrome, it's particularly gratifying to see return of periods and often fertility. Migraines can be improved with less frequent attacks and less medication. And irritable bowel can be improved with better bowel function and less discomfort. Okay, and now on to the management of conditions using carbohydrate reduction. We're talking about obesity, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, raised blood pressure, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and migraine. And the principles are the same for each condition. Baseline data includes weight, blood pressure, blood tests, and a basic food inquiry. And then carbohydrate reduction depends on what one is trying to achieve. So some people can just reduce carbohydrates by a modest degree to achieve weight loss, for example, and others might need to get stricter. Say, for example, you have type 2 diabetes and you want to reverse or remit that, then you would have to look at a significant reduction in carbohydrates. And we tend to use grams of carbohydrates per 24 hours to guide in terms of carbohydrate intake. And then we've got the green lists and the red lists. The green lists are the foods that we should be eating, and the red lists are the foods that we should avoid or only have occasionally. So now we come on to the foods to eat with low carb eating, the green list. So essentially all meat is on, especially with the fat on it. All seafood, especially oily fish for the omega-3 fats. Eggs in any number, any way you like. Dairy products should be full cream. Anything low fat has got sugar in it. Greek yogurt is best for yogurt. Cream cheese, full cream milk, butter, it's all good. And then with regards to vegetables, anything that grows above the ground is ideal. So kindly avoid potatoes and kumara. And then fruit is also out, apart from berries, because fruit contains sucrose and fructose, both of which are not good for the body, in particular the liver. And then fats and oils include olive oil, avocado oil, butter, ghee, coconut oil, and proper mayonnaise. And then when it comes to nuts, all nuts except peanuts and cashews. And drinks, really most drinks are on except those high in carbohydrates. In other words, only diet drinks should be consumed, and alcoholic beverages, you're really looking at avoiding too much beer, too much red wine, and too much of spirits. So when it comes to foods to avoid, the so-called red list, or orange list here, you're looking at carbs, sugar, dense sugars, starches. All these are contained in things such as soft drinks, pastries, kumara, potato chips, sweets, the whole list of items there at the top. As mentioned, fruit is out as it contains a lot of sucrose and fructose. Dried fruit similarly, concentrated sucrose and fructose sugar. Fats and oils, avoid margarine, avoid corn oils, seed oils in general. They have been cold pressed and then converted in a factory so that they have a longer shelf life and can be heated to a higher heat. Why would you want something so unnatural? I mentioned drinks before, such as beer and wines and cider and cordials. Dairy products, again, low fat, beware. Processed foods, processed cheese in particular, beware, and tinned condensed milk. Meat and fish, well, if you're going to batter it, crumb it, marinate it, sugar cure it, then you may find that it has a significantly high content of carbohydrates. Fast food, burgers, hot dogs, spare ribs, etc., pizza, again full of carbohydrates, especially when you consider the buns that come with them. Sauces, beware sauces such as barbecue sauce, cooking sauces, often very sweet, high carbohydrate content. And then other foods mentioned peanuts, syrups, table sugar, fructose, glucose, dextrose, chickpeas, corn and peas, all to be avoided largely because of their high carbohydrate content. Now here is an infographic produced by Dr. David Unwin, a GP in the United Kingdom, who's done some amazing work in the low carb sphere. And it shows the relative amount of glucose per food substance and then relating that to serving size. Now each substance has its own glycemic index, its ability to generate glucose. And when you relate that to the serving size, you can see just how many teaspoons of table sugar are in each serving. A very useful and demonstrative diagram. So continuing on the advice regarding carbohydrate reduction, it's also about being carb aware. In other words, looking at food packaging and just getting an idea of how many carbohydrates, grams of carbohydrates are in portions of foods. You can count carbs if you like. It's quite useful to start so that you get an idea of how much you're actually eating. And there are a couple of free apps you can use. One is MyFitnessPal and the other one is Easy Diet Diary. A couple of caveats to starting a low carb diet. If you have high blood pressure or diabetes, taking medication, then that needs some input from a doctor who's familiar with low carb eating, because you can see some quite dramatic changes in both blood pressure as well as blood sugar, and that can be quite hazardous potentially. Then it is important to have regular follow-ups where measurements can be taken, for example, blood pressure, weight, as well as blood tests can be taken to monitor progress. So now to move on to some case studies. This is an example of a young man, aged 31, with diabetes. This is what we call type 2 diabetes, which really relates to insulin resistance. He started with pre-diabetes. We can see the measure of diabetes. It's the HbA1c. That's the measure there. Starting at 45, that's pre-diabetes, shoots up to 110, above 50 on 2 occasions, diagnoses diabetes. Well, he's 110, so he's clearly got diabetes. And you can see that he was not overweight, had normal BMI, and was able to reduce his HbA1c down to 41 from 112 in a matter of just a few months, 6 months in fact. And this is quite incredible and quite doable. And here is another case of a 31-year-old male who was somewhat overweight with a raised BMI, had no pre-diabetes, but one day turned out with an HbA1c of over 90. In other words, diabetes was the diagnosis. And literally within a matter of 6 months, again, had dropped his HbA1c down to 49 from 93. So again, a great result. Now this is a 61-year-old male who was overweight with a BMI of 30.1, managed to drop that to 27.8. He had diabetes with an HbA1c of about 61. This fell to 44 again in literally 3 to 4 months. Now this next one is one I'm particularly proud of. This was a 70-year-old female who was significantly overweight with a BMI of 45.8 with established diabetes. She was intolerant of 2 of the commonest and available drugs at the time. And you can see her weight here. We're really looking at the right-hand side of the graph, where she goes from 125 kilos down to 90 kilos. And you can see her diabetes profile, her HbA1c from 18th September 2018, going from a level of 100 down to 40. This was at the same time involving reducing her insulin. She dropped and stopped 65 units of insulin and had a total of 32 kilograms weight loss. Very pleased with that indeed. Here is a case of reversal of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. A 55-year-old male who was overweight with a BMI of 32.7. He dropped that to 23.6, losing just over 25 kilograms in 4 months. See on the left-hand side, going from right to left, the abnormal liver function test, the GGT and ALT, both normalized. You can see his cholesterol profile improves in that, going from right to left, the cholesterol total is really unchanged. The triglycerides, a form of bad fat, have gone from 5.8 to 1.1, which is great. The protective cholesterol has gone from 0.93 to 1.1, and the cholesterol ratio is also favourable. Here we're looking at weight loss and blood pressure improvement. A 70-year-old with a BMI of 43.6, fallen to 38.9, that's 12 kilograms weight loss in approximately 4 months. Blood pressure recordings here from left to right, you can see they're basically coming down, just about, but at the same time you're stopping the maximum dose of a drug called cilazapril. So although the levels are roughly the same, in actual fact the medication has stopped completely. So the take-home messages from today's presentation are: a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet has made us fat and sick. Returning to the way of eating that humans evolved to eat is what we're talking about. Carbohydrate reduction is doable, sustainable and safe, and the cholesterol profile usually improves. It helps to have initial advice, guidance and support. This first and foremost is about reduction in the amount of carbs. It does not have to be keto, but we are changing the food that an individual eats permanently. Treats are absolutely okay, but not on top of a full carb diet. I acknowledge that not everyone can do this, and that's okay. Prediabetes tells us that there is already insulin resistance present due to long-term carbohydrate exposure, and one needs to be proactive to prevent progression to diabetes and all its potential misery. We know that prediabetes can already start to produce blood vessel damage. Diabetes is reversed or remitted through carbohydrate reduction. It will return if carbohydrates are consumed to the previous level. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you found it useful. Please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Further information and resources can be found here in the internet. The global resource on carbohydrate reduction is dietdoctor.com, and I mentioned the sugar graphics from David Unwin, located at that website. There are several apps that can be used to help track carbs if that's what you'd like to do: MyFitnessPal, Easy Diet Diary and the Low Carb Project. And some really useful documentaries that put into perspective why I'm doing this: Fat Fiction, The Magic Pill and Fat, a Documentary. Some useful books: The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz details the whole cholesterol issue over the last 50 to 60 years. Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, an investigational journalist like Nina, who talks about carbohydrates and what it's done to our societies. What the Fat is a New Zealand-based book about low-carb eating with recipes produced by Grant Schofield, Karen Zinn and Craig Roger from AUT. I administer a Facebook group with over 2,500 people, and I'm always available for questions if anyone has any issues that they want to discuss. So thank you again, and look forward to presenting a bit more detail on how to implement a low-carb diet in the next talk.